William Blake once wrote a poem whose lines go like this: "Joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine." Blank was saying joy and woe are a part of the fabric of life, and sometimes life is difficult, but we take hope and we take joy in the fact that it is God who weaves all of our experiences together, and weaves in a way in which we are a blessing to others, and that we find true life and joy in Him. We now take up the final of the Beatitudes, and it's a paradox, just like we've seen many other paradoxes. Can you imagine what the first disciples felt when they heard these words? And think about how many people who first have read them in Scripture might have reacted to hearing, "Blessed are those who are being persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before them." Matthew Henry, the great Puritan commentator, believed that the reason Christ repeated himself here was because the statement was so incredible. He wanted to reinforce the fact that life is not easy. Too often we hear Christians talking about, when it came to Jesus, everything fell into place and my life was so good. Well, maybe spiritually, but not always physically. We have to understand that there is a repetition in this. He says, "Blessed are you," to begin with, and then he goes, are those to begin with, and then he goes on to say, "Blessed are you when men cast insults at you and persecute you." It's again a reminder, a double whammy, if you want to put it that way, a reinforcement that sometimes persecution comes our way. Supernatural joy amidst trial has been the repeated experience of the church. When Peter and the other apostles were flogged before the Sanhedrin in our text from Acts 5, we are told they went away rejoicing because they were considered worthy to suffer shame for his name. They experienced supernatural joy in persecution, as did some of the Protestant reformers of the 16th century, and many others down through the years who have been persecuted for their faith. One Romanian pastor, before communism left Romania, was persecuted for his faith, thrown in prison for 6 months or so, and beaten viciously. And he said one of the strange things was that several times after severe beatings, he'd be dumped in his cell, and suddenly he found himself standing up and dancing. He'd just been beaten. And he said it was almost as if God was saying, "I am with you. You are experiencing this joy because I know how hard this is to get through." And many others have given that same kind of witness, that in a time of difficulty, God came to them and brought them a sense of joy and purpose that counteracted what their physical circumstances seemed to be saying. Now, we have to be very careful because the text says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake," not those who are persecuted. Because many people are persecuted for things that maybe they should be persecuted for. Joseph Bailey wrote a little story as a sort of a satirical look at how Christians sometimes behave. It's called The Gospel Blimp. And one of the things that comes out of here is that there is a group of Christians who decided they wanted to evangelize their neighborhood. And so they hired a blimp to go across the sky over town with a banner behind it with a gospel message. Well, the response wasn't quite what they wanted it to be, and so they started having the blimp drop gospel tracts through the air into people's backyards. Well, still, it didn't have the effect they wanted, and the neighbors were somewhat tolerant of what was going on. And so they hired someone to put speakers on the blimp, and as they went back and forth over the town, they began to play gospel preaching from different preachers. And it was at a very loud volume so that people could hear it inside their houses. And unfortunately, they also did this sometimes late in the evening after other people had been trying to go to sleep. Well, the paper wrote an editorial saying, the people of town have been tolerant of this because we understand sort of what they're trying to do. But now they've become obnoxious. They're aggravating. That night, after the editorial had come out, somebody attacked the gospel blimp and poked holes in it. And the Christians came back and felt that they were being persecuted. And what Joseph Bailey is saying is, no, they were not being persecuted. This is the natural result of being annoying, of being judgmental, of acting in a way that in many respects is not at all Christian. Many times people feel that they're being persecuted by non-Christians when indeed it's just that they are obnoxious and arrogant and judgmental. And so we have to step back and say, what does it say? It's for righteousness' sake. And what is righteousness all about? Well, the 7 preceding Beatitudes are talking about a style of life, a way of living that sometimes makes people uncomfortable because it brings a certain element of judgment, not because you're trying to, but simply because you're living life in a way very different than what the world would be telling you to live, what society wants to see. We're caught up right now in a political climate where both ends of the political spectrum are absolutely obnoxious, absolutely hateful. There's no communication. And sometimes we find that there are Christians caught up on both ends of the spectrum who are that way. They think that people are reacting to them with persecution when indeed all it really is that they are obnoxious and hateful themselves. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And in that 15th chapter of John, we hear Jesus telling his disciples, don't be surprised when people don't receive you kindly because they have not received my message kindly. Because you're not doing what the world says they want you to do. The message you bring might make them uncomfortable and they'll lash out at you. Jesus said, if there's a wind in my face, it's going to happen to you too. And Paul made that very clear in many of his epistles to churches he was writing to, saying, don't take the persecution you're experiencing as if you're going in the wrong direction, because Jesus said this is what's going to come. Now, we've got to be careful because we have to use this to ask ourselves a question. Is our faith vital enough, vibrant enough, that there are times when we too face an element of persecution? Very often we discover that if we try and live out the Beatitudes, and we can't do it on our own power, it is by the grace of God, and we can never do it fully. The fact is, people will start looking at us and get uncomfortable. They won't like the fact that we very often will stand up for the oppressed. They won't like the fact that we will tell them that we follow a different standard of morals than what they do. They don't want to hear it because they don't want to hear anyone telling them they're wrong. And all we have to do right now is look at our political process. Both sides of the spectrum are so tone deaf to what anybody else says that they just lash out in anger. And many Christians to find themselves somewhere in the middle are catching the heat from both sides. Why? Because they're not agreeing with what people say they should agree with. Some of you know the experience of if you tell someone on Facebook that you don't quite agree with their post, suddenly they unfriend you. They don't want to hear anything from anybody who will tell them that maybe they're not 100% right. The nature of persecution is the fact that we Christians are sometimes going to have society tell us that we're making them uncomfortable. And one of the things I want you to be aware of is that, first of all, none of us are going to be persecuted all the time. And the fact is, if we're being persecuted all the time, maybe there is something we have to adjust in what we're saying. But in our society, persecution tends not to come in a physical abuse that the early church perhaps experienced. But it comes more in that verbal and social ostracism that often occurs because Christians do speak up for what they believe. Sometimes it comes when a conscientious worker who has spent 20 years of faithful service in a company gets passed over again and again because they will not go along with the fudging of the truth or of the statistics that their bosses want to occur. Or maybe somebody gets cut off in terms of social communication on Facebook, or people just don't talk to them anymore simply because they have not gone along with the discourse of people. They don't buy into everything that somebody says. The other day I saw an advertisement for something that said that they are purposely putting together online news that is coming from multiple sources so that in one place you get in the same categories what everybody is saying about an issue and see how different it is. If you really want to know how people feel and you really want to make a good, hard, honest evaluation from a biblical perspective, take a look what everyone is saying and ask yourself the question, is there something I need to hear here? But the fact is, the world is not going to treat us well when we don't automatically agree with their sinful perversions. Very often we discover that if you don't enjoy the movies everyone is talking about, if you don't buy into the spending of money for certain things that other people feel are important, suddenly you feel that you're pushed away. You become an outsider. And that's one of the things that Jesus means here about persecution. Sometimes it is major persecution. We have not lived in that kind of day and age. But the fact is, there should be times when people don't like what we have to say. Because unless our lives are shining out for Christ, that they are being lived for Christ, then we're not having any effect on the society around us. Why is that? Well, sometimes it's because Christians have divorced themselves from society in general. We play golf with only Christians or play tennis with only Christians. We send our kids to Christian schools. We don't have friends outside the church. It goes on and on. We have no real impact in the society around us. About 100 years after Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount from which the Beatitudes came, someone came to the great church father Tertullian He said his business interests and his Christianity were conflicted. He ended by saying, "What can I do? I must live." And Tertullian just answered with the statement, "Must you?" It brought the man up short. We have a higher goal than just making money. We have a higher goal than just having everyone like us. We're called to be ambassadors for Jesus Christ. We're called to shape the world around us, to help people see a different way of living, a different life. And that means sometimes we are going to have to be in dialogue with people who get a little heated about the fact that we don't see the world from their point of view. Nadine and I, when we moved from Dearborn to Paxton, had to make some repairs to our house because the building codes, while they hadn't changed, were being enforced in an area that should have been done 20 years before we bought the house. And now, because of a number of fires, they were enforcing this. And we had to find a construction person who would put in a new ceiling in our story-and-a-half bedroom. And this man was available in part because he had left a family business. Had become a Christian, and some of the ways that this family had made money had begun to really get into his heart as being wrong. They had managed to make sure that some of their income was not going into the cash register, but was basically being brought in off the books. And he felt it was wrong. And when he confronted his dad about this, his dad said, "Well, I can't employ all my loved ones if we're not making more money than what we're making." And so he made the decision to go off on his own and do some contracting work. And he said the irony is, even though his brothers didn't really like what he had done, they felt an element of judgment because he was telling them what they were doing was wrong. He said in one sense, God was blessing him because he had all the work he could possibly do. He felt it was almost God saying to him, "You've taken the right choice. Yes, you've moved away from a lucrative family business, but you're doing what you feel you need to do in my name." There is joy in the midst of this. Sometimes it is a joy that seems supernatural. Sometimes it is a matter that there is a joy because we find purpose and meaning in life in a way that maybe we hadn't understood before. We're being assured that in some way, shape, or form, there will be joy. In 2 Corinthians 4:17, Paul says, "For momentarily light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison." In one sense, when we get to heaven, it will be all worth it all when we see Jesus. And in another sense, God often gives us a blessing in this life because even though we may not make the financial gains of other people, we have a satisfactory life, a joyful life, a life we feel good about. And even in the midst of real persecution, we discover that God is often walking with us because we find ourselves rejoicing even in tight places. We've come to the end of our study on the Beatitudes. The next 3 weeks we are going to be touching on some leftovers from the Sermon on the Mount. Each of them has to do with an element of what we've talked about, but it also fits the Sunday of the church year, so we'll continue on.